last 10, 20 years has been good for most people living in poor countries. They've started to catch up, started to converge with the lucky billion. I'm going to talk about a group of countries where that just isn't true, not even in the last decade, which for most developing countries was the golden decade. So don't think Malaysia, don't think India, don't think Brazil. Think Mali, Central African Republic, South Sudan, DRC. Right? That's the world we're going to look at. And that world hasn't been converging with the rest of mankind. It's been falling behind, and it's been falling apart. So if we look at just 3 of those countries, Mali, last year, Mali came within days of being taken over and becoming the next Taliban-run Afghanistan. It was saved from that by a last-minute military intervention from the French, which the French didn't want to do and was very embarrassing for Africa. Just even more recently, Central African Republic. That dissolved into murderous civil violence. And again, the French military intervention at the last minute to try and restore the peace. And that's ongoing as we speak. South Sudan, an ethnic come natural resource-based civil war, ongoing. So these are the situations. So what can be done? Well, step 1 is to establish some sort of security in these countries. What is demonstrably the case is that these countries are not able to provide their own security. And so, can we do better than leaving it to the last minute and having the French fly in? There is a standing American force for Africa called AFRICOM, based in the African city of Stuttgart, which is conveniently located for the rest of Africa. It's a rapid reaction force, but when Mali was about to fall apart, it may be rapid, but it didn't react. Right? It just stayed there in Stuttgart. So can we get some better approach than the sort of last minute? And I don't think it's difficult to think what should be done. The analogy here is what America did for Europe 50 years ago, 60 years ago with NATO. America poured in money, logistics, and troops, but basically it led the task of coordinating Europe to look after its own security. And that's kind of what Africa needs now. Africa needs a standing force which is larger than can be supplied just by the government of Mali to protect Mali, the government of the Central African Republic to provide security in the CAR, etc. So you need a common African force, whether at the level of a region like ECOWAS or at the level of the whole of Africa, African Union. But Africans are in no position to pay for it. And so it has to be financed and provisioned by Europe. And that is not something that can be done in 6 months. This is a strategy of a couple of decades. And so we need to think long-term about security. That's something we've been spectacularly bad at doing. If you just think of the international attitudes to security intervention, if we go back, in my little book, The Bottom Billion, I sort of went through a cycle. The tragedy is that since the bottom billion, we've just been through another round of the cycle. So the cycle begins with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, international intervention, liberates Kuwait, very successful. Great. So the next time there's trouble, it's Somalia. In go the Americans. I was actually getting off a plane in Nairobi just as the American force was being assembled. And so off the baggage cart, along with my luggage, came all the American paraphernalia. And what was the key paraphernalia they needed for a security operation in Somalia? Television cameras. Because this was going to be a huge success, just like Kuwait. And so what they needed was television cameras. And if you do the relevant YouTubing, you'll probably find clips where, as the American troops come ashore in Somalia, there are the television cameras there to record it. So this was a TV event, not a serious security operation. And of course, it got its comeuppance. It ended tragically. And that led to a situation in which, right, no more military interventions, no matter what. What did that produce? Rwanda. After Rwanda, we were back in the business of let's have military intervention. That produced Iraq and Afghanistan. Disasters. Right? Too much intervention. And now we're back at the level of don't intervene whatever. And that's why AFRICOM sat on its hands whilst Mali was being invaded by a gang of Gaddafi mercenaries. Yeah? So we've got to get out of this cycle of reaction, of swinging from over-intervention to non-intervention. We need to build African security institutions, and that will take Western patience and sustained intervention. So that's the place to start, security. What's the next step? The next step is that the big resource that these countries have is their own natural resources. And over the last decade, there's been a wave of natural resource discoveries triggered by higher commodity prices. And so places like Mali, CAR, South Sudan have had these big resource discoveries. And the challenge now is to help them to actually harness those resources for development. Harnessing them first requires them to be physically extracted. They can't do that themselves. They need resource extraction companies. And keen as you all are to work for NGOs, getting a job with a decent resource extraction company can do an awful lot of good for Africa. But it can also do an awful lot of harm, because resource extraction companies are the custodians of the natural assets of poor countries. The resources that they take out of the ground don't belong to the resource extraction companies. They're entitled to a decent return. They're taking risk and skill and they're investing capital. So they need a decent return, but what economists call the rents on those natural resources actually belong to the people of the country, not to the resource extraction companies. So they're custodians of other people's assets. That should ring some sort of bells that resource extraction companies are a bit analogous to the other bunch of companies which are custodians of other people's assets, banks. Now, we've learnt the hard way that banks need a higher level of scrutiny and regulation than, say, an ordinary manufacturing company. It's taken us 50 years of international action to try and build that scrutiny and governance of banks. And manifestly, it's still unfinished business. With natural resource companies, we are where we were with banks 50 years ago. So there's a huge task to do to build that structure of governance of resource extraction companies. It starts with transparency, and there we've made real progress. I was an advisor to the G8 process in Enniskillen, and we got a lot of progress on resource transparency. So that's step one. Step two is to actually be able to have the governments of poor countries capture the revenues. And the way they capture the revenues of resource extraction companies is through the tax system. Now, for them to be able to tax these companies, tax is technical. Don't think resource extraction companies, think cups of coffee. Right? Some of you got them. Right? Think Starbucks. Right? What do we know about Starbucks and tax? Right? We know that the British tax authorities versus Starbucks accountants, who won? Right? Starbucks. Right? And now, picture yourself, say, government of Guinea versus some of the most sophisticated resource extraction companies in the world. It's not an equal contest. Even if we could get it to the level of Starbucks versus HMRC, it's a struggle. But if they cannot implement effective tax systems, then those assets of which the resource extraction companies are supposed to be the custodians, they acquire full ownership of. This is something that individual African countries can't do much about. They haven't got the capacity, just haven't got the skilled people, so they need a tidal wave of accountants, basically, people who really understand tax design, and they need better international rules, just as we need better international rules in order to prevent the games that Starbucks was up to. So that's the second layer, is the taxation side. Then there's a final layer, which is corruption. And the resource extraction companies are an amazing spectrum. If you go and work for them, you might find yourself in one of the most transparent companies in the world. And if you look at the corporate ranking of transparency, top of global transparency are a couple of the big resource extraction companies. That wasn't true 10 years ago, but it is now. But there's a very long tail. There are a lot of crooked companies. If you're a crooked resource extraction company and you want to get a good deal, the easiest way is not to be skilled in negotiation, it's to bribe some public official. Public officials in Africa or other poor countries have the responsibility, in their hands is billions of dollars of resources. And they can be very easily tempted by going from impoverishment to being worth a few $1 million to hand over those resources for next to nothing. And that's what's happened again and again and again. So how can we check that point of corruption? And the answer is follow the money. Suppose some crooked company pays a few $1 million in a bribe to an African official. What happens to that money? It's very hard for a decent African government to police those negotiations. Often they'll be done in secret. So the easiest point of intervention is to follow corrupt money. So what happens to that bribe? Suppose a corrupt official takes $5 million bribe. Well, you don't keep it under the bed. Right? So what do you do with it? You don't keep it in the country. That's much too dangerous. So you want to get it out of the country, you want to put it in a bank. But you don't want anybody to know that that bank account is yours. So, how do you do it? I feel a little hesitant to tell you, but the answer is you go to a law firm, not in your own country. Most of the law firms are in London, right? And you find a law firm which will set up a company whose true ownership cannot be discovered. So there'll be nominee control owners of the company. So the nominees are reported, but they're not the true owners. The true owners, called the beneficial owners, can't be discovered. And believe it or not, it's been very easy to set up companies where nobody can discover who the beneficial owner of the company is, the true owner of the company. We're much more careless in the way that new companies are registered than we are in the way new people are registered. And yet, in terms of economic actors, companies are much more important than people. So, we've got a class of companies that can be set up, and nobody can detect who owns the company. Then what does the company do? It goes to a secrecy haven, Cayman Islands or something like that. It opens a bank account in the name of the company. The essence of the secrecy haven is that it doesn't ask. It just says, oh, this bank account's owned by this company, there, closed. So the $5 million is parked in that bank account. It's perfectly safe, perfectly legal, and cannot be detected. And I work with African governments that are struggling to detect where corrupt money is. So what can be done about that? Well, at the G8, we started to tackle it. And the essence of the problem is you shouldn't have companies whose true ownership cannot be known. And Britain, rather heroically, actually took the lead here. Britain was one of the epicenters of the problem, to be honest. And so Britain actually announced at the G8 that they would keep a record of the true ownership of all companies. And then since the G8, actually thanks to David Cameron, who led this campaign, we've now committed to having a public register. So all the true ownership of all companies registered in Britain now becomes public information. But we live in a world, not just a country. And so now the battle is to take that new standard and make it global. The transparency battle has been taken global and is largely won. It's not completely won, but at the G8, 5 of the G8 countries signed up for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Europe and Canada followed America in what's called the Cardin-Lugar Amendment, requiring resource extraction companies registered in their jurisdictions to report payments to governments. So the transparency battle is going global. The battle over beneficial ownership has just begun. The only reason that it's so problematic is public ignorance. Because once you pose the question, should it be possible to have bank accounts with millions of dollars in them where it's not possible to discover who actually owns that money, you've already got an answer. It's ridiculous to run a global society like that. Who benefits? Crooks. And so the challenge is to make this issue public and public internationally. And that's why I welcomed the chance to come to TED and talk about it. Thanks very much.